So let me say a few words about myself after the beautiful introduction by Dora. One of the reasons actually that I really wanted to start to write a history of the humanities and also work a little bit on the long-term history of humanities and sciences is that I wanted to figure out what my own field, digital humanities, was about. I was trained in computational linguistics, natural language processing, but I did know not that much about musicology, philology, art history. And I thought one way of figuring out what these disciplines are about is to studying also their history. So that's actually what my intention was and still is. And one of the things that we can immediately figure out is that in the beginning, whatever that means, in the beginning of people studying nature, of people studying culture, so in the beginning of science and humanities, and you know that in the English, in the Anglophone world, there is this dichotomy between science on the one hand and humanities on the other hand, which is usually in other languages collected with one word, wetenschap in Dutch or Wissenschaft, but also there you have these distinctions between Naturwissenschaft in German, sciences, natural sciences, and Geisteswissenschaft, the humanities. But if we talk about the earliest moments in the history of science and humanities, then certainly we already figure out that before the 1800s, and certainly you've heard this before, I guess, you even have a room here which is called the C.P. Snow room, I think, right? So you're all aware about this distinction. But before the 1800s, there's basically no such distinction. Does this work? Yeah. There's no conceptual distinction even between the study of nature and the study of culture. There are some people, like Giambattista Vico, I mentioned perhaps him later, that makes a distinction between, on the one hand, you can study what is made by humans, namely culture, and on the other hand, you can study what is made by God, as he calls it, namely nature. But in principle, you use the same methods. In fact, if we look at the early periods, or even at the beginning of the start of science and humanities, then you find that even the most famous persons, the icons of science, were philologists, historians, and natural philosophers at the same time. I mention here, let me stay here. I'll mention here Galileo, Galilei, Johannes Kepler, Isaac Newton. They did not only work in the field of physics and astronomy, but also in the field of philology, the study of old texts. For example, Kepler even he discovered that the actual birth of Jesus Christ had to be at least 4 years earlier than had been written down in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, sorry about that. In fact, it's hard to say that we can distinguish between these two fields. In fact, this is exactly also what my book is about, that has just appeared, as Dora has so nicely mentioned. But then, at a certain point in time, came the Great Divide, as we could call it. I already mentioned this German distinction. That's one of the earliest so strong distinctions between Geisteswissenschaften, the humanities on the one hand, and Naturwissenschaften at the other hand. But actually, this distinction gets institutionalized in universities in all places in Europe, and with the European expansion, if not to call it simply colonialism, it is also exported abroad. First to places like Japan, America, but also to all other places from China to Africa, to the Arab world, to Latin America, etc. Now, as I said, there are many forerunners, and I mentioned here some people, but I won't go into all of them, that would be too much. But certainly every country has its own particular history of this great divide. And if you come, for example, from a different country than Holland or Britain, as I just mentioned, C.P. Snow, it might be interesting to figure out how this actually works. But here's actually a kind of a pun between, on the one hand, science, math, engineering, and on the other hand, you have to go at the right-hand side to find the humanities. Now, what actually resulted in, what did this actually result in? It resulted in what we now call these two fields of knowing, which were conceptualized by German philosophers like Dilthey, Windelband, but there are many others. Recursion, Cassirer, maybe you've even studied some of them already, I don't know. Also C.P. Snow, whom I mentioned, Gadamer, and many others. So on the one hand, you had the humanities. These are, so to say, idiographic, not silly, but a very exaggerated, difficult term, which just means focusing on the idios, on the specific, which was also sometimes referred to as focusing on verstehen, which means actually understanding. So the humanities try to understand, they try to interpret, whereas the sciences, they focus on the nomothetic, which is again a somewhat complex term, nomos, which in Greek, oh sorry, I have to be careful, Dora is Greek, but in Greek means law, I think, and still means that. So nomothetic, studying the nomos, the law-like, and focuses more on the general. So it focuses more on trying to explain things rather than trying to interpret, to understand things. Now, some of you might think, and what about the social sciences? Well, the social sciences were institutionalized slightly later. Most of the fields that we now call social sciences, like sociology, pedagogics, or psychology, were initially also called Geisteswissenschaften. Really, you won't believe it perhaps, but if you look at the early 20th century, we're all gathered, the social sciences and humanities were initially all gathered under Geisteswissenschaften. Now, actually what is interesting, these two persons, Dilthey and Windelband, this late 19th century German philosophers really actually wanted to emancipate the humanities. They thought this is a great field, this Geisteswissenschaften, but they get a little bit underappreciated by the fact that the natural sciences have so many beautiful technological applications, right? So they thought we have to emancipate them and say, fair enough, the sciences explain the world, but we humanities people, we humanities scholars are actually interpreting the world. And some famous humanities scholar, Karl Marx, even said, even can change the world with that, right? Rather than only interpreting. Now the funny thing is that although this division, this distinction between, let's say, explaining versus interpreting is extremely interesting conceptually, it did not correspond to actual practice. Sometimes I make a pun about it, I make a joke about it by saying this is the way often philosophers talk. They talk about things as they believe and hope the world would look like, but if you look at actual practice, like of course historians do, right, the more empirical scientists, the more empirical scholars, you see that there are different practices. Now this is a bit of an exaggeration. This is a bit of an exaggeration because also philosophers, of course, look at reality. They don't simply invent theories by themselves. But it's important, I just want to say, it's important not to stay only with philosophy. You also have to look at the history of the disciplines. And then you see actually a surprise. And this will actually, this is exactly what my talk will be about. You will see that the interactions between science and the humanities, and also the social sciences, also continued after this great divide. After this divide, when the natural sciences showed enormous potential in technological innovations, you still see that, for example, in linguistics, certain notions of formal grammar are used later on in computer science. I'll talk about it. You see an influence from philology to biology. Philology, the study of texts, nowadays also called literary studies, for example, or literary theory. You see influences going from history, historiography, so history writing, to astronomy. And there's much and much more. Okay, but let me go into a few examples, because otherwise it remains so abstract. I want to deal at least with a couple of 4 or 5 examples that come from different centuries. And I hope you can bear with me, because I realize that I'm also a very, very fast speaker, and I can only tell you that you might be lucky that I don't give my talk in Dutch, because then it would be quadratically or even exponentially faster, probably. Anyway, as I said, or no, as already Dora nicely said, I started doing this work already 11, 12 years ago, and then as a kind of stream of consciousness, you could say, I wrote a book initially in Dutch. I never wrote a monograph before, by the way. I basically worked on journal articles, but I thought, let's write a book on it, and it was translated into English and a number of other languages. And my question in that book, and also in the translation, of course, is still, how did the humanities and the sciences actually interact? Not just in Europe, but also in other regions. And I really wanted to make it global. And actually, I should tell you a little secret. When I thought I had finished my book, I was about to publish it. My wife, who is an Africanist, by the way, said, but there's no Africa in the whole book. I mean, there's North Africa, okay, the Arab world, but there's no Black Africa. What about the great Timbuktu manuscripts from Mali, for example? What about great Zimbabwe? What about Ethiopia with their 2,000 year of scholarly tradition? And I had to admit that I didn't know anything about it. So again, yet I dived into the history of the African humanities, which even goes back further than the European humanities. You might be surprised about that. And I really tried to make it, as you say, what we call nowadays multi-centric. So using different centers, multi-centric or polycentric, using different centers and studying the humanities from all these different centers in the world. Now, today, I won't have time to go into all these regions. I won't talk about Polynesia today. I will talk about India, briefly. But if you want to know more, of course, just buy my book or rent it or lend it from the library. Right? So, but bear with me. I'll go through the history of the humanities in less than half an hour. That is left for me and talking about 25 centuries. But there's one problem. Before we go any further, there's one anachronistic problem. And I know that there are some historians sitting around me. You still have to graduate, I guess, in history or any other field. But some historians often tell me, oh, wait a minute, you're using the term humanities also for disciplines um, in a period when the very term humanities simply did not yet exist. This is true. But there did exist other terms. For example, studia humanitatis in Latin did exist already since the 14th century. We have also the artes liberalis, the liberal arts, which already existed since the early antiquity. So actually, I only use the humanities as an umbrella term by referring to those disciplines that study the expressions of the human mind. So the expressions like language, music, theater, poetry, literature, art. And these disciplines that study those expressions, these are simply called humanities disciplines. So just to make it easy for now. And then you can say, wait a minute, history of the humanities does not start in the 19th century when the term was basically invented. It starts already in antiquity. Already from antiquity onwards, people studied language, studied literature, art, music, etc. Let me start with the study of language then. And if we look at the earliest moments when human beings have studied the properties of natural language, of human language, we shouldn't start with the Greeks, but we start usually in India. It's in the 6th century, 600 BCE, before Common Era, that we find a wonderful text. I don't give the full title of the text, but it's called 8 books, Ashtanyadi, it's Sanskrit. Ashtanyadi, 8 books, which contains a huge grammar of Sanskrit. It contains almost 4,000 rules, to be exact 3,959 rules that describe the semantic, syntactic, morphological and phonological rules. Forget these words, don't mind what semantic, syntactic, morphological, phonological means at this very moment. But the idea of this grammar and the idea of Panini, that's the name, that's the mythical name. We don't really know if he ever had existed, although we have a beautiful post stamp from India, indeed, referring to this great linguist. And it's interesting that he is represented almost as a mathematician, but he was a linguist. He never wrote anything about math. Although he invented a very important concept that I will talk in the next slide about. But his underlying idea was that a language can be seen as a rule-based system that can produce all correct forms of Sanskrit, of a language, in his case Sanskrit, with finite means. So with a finite set of rules, you can in principle produce all possible sentences that are even in principle infinitely large, because you can always make a longer sentence if you like, right? And what he also discovered, and I realize I remain now a little bit superficial, I just scratched the surface about it, because otherwise I won't have enough time. But you can always follow a course that I'm teaching in the Master, Brain and Cognitive Science, but that's after your bachelor, of course. But one of the greatest inventions that Panini also created was the concept of recursion. I guess the term recursion is not an entirely unknown term. Maybe some of you have already heard about it. Who knows what recursion is about? Anybody know it? Some people, not everybody. So it has not just been dealt with in the course of logic, if at all. So recursion is the idea that a part, well, it's a very complex idea, actually, but the idea is that you have a part, if you have a rule-based recursion, let's say that, then a part of a rule is also, again, invoked in the rule itself. So you have a kind of infinite idea of recursion. But there are many notions of recursion. Here's an example of visual recursion, where the part of the image, here it's not the rule, a part of the image, let me see, a part of the image is again equal to the image itself, which again, in this smaller part, is again equal to it, and you could go on ad infinitum if there were not a finite number of pixels, of course, right? But in principle, you could go on forever. And in language, Panini discovered, and I don't give you the Sanskrit example, but now I'll give you an English example. Panini discovered that both in phonology, but phonology is the study of sounds of language, but also in syntax, which describes the word order of languages, he found out that you can have a notion of recursion, where a part of a sentence can be seen, a part of a sentence, like a clause, can be again part of the sub-sentence, so what we sometimes call also a sub-clause. Here's an example. I saw the man who called the boy, who kissed his sister, who hit the child on the road, for example, right? But you could, in principle, go on forever. Huh? I saw the man who called the boy, who kissed his sister, who hit the child, who ran away after a dog was, pissing at the sun, whatever. Okay. You could make this sentence longer every time. And what happens is that you, with this particular construction, I saw some noun phrase, and then who, and then you could even make a boring sentence, like I saw the man who called the man, who kissed the man, who hit the man. It's still a valid sentence of English, isn't it? It's a boring sentence, but it's still valid. It's still grammatical, as we call it. Now, Panini figured out, and I should look at the time, yeah. Panini figured out that you could, in principle, create an underlying rule system for these sentences by finite means. And that's an extremely important idea, that by simply, invoking the same rule, same grammar rule, and making it part of the previous rule, you can create longer and longer sentences. Now, why am I now making the move, an enormous move, from Panini to modern computer science? I'm making that move because, interestingly, Panini's grammar was widely studied by the Indian Brahmins, by the Indian Sanskrit scholars, but his grammar was almost not known, was almost entirely unknown in Europe until the late 18th century, and especially the 19th century, because although it was known, it happened to be known briefly a little bit in 11th century Iran, Persia at that time. It was it only became known by became really studied by German linguists in the 19th century, and it actually was fully understood in the course of the 20th century. And what happened is actually that people that were working on creating the first higher level programming languages, in particular the programming language which is known as Algol 60, discovered that the grammar of Panini was extreme. The grammar formalism, I should say, which is often referred to as a kind of context-sensitive grammar, but forget about that word. But the interesting thing is, I mentioned it here, the interesting thing is that the particular grammar formalism was extremely apt for creating programming languages, for creating the syntax and also the so-called compilers, maybe you've heard about compilers in computer science, I don't know, of programming languages. And this is a wonderful, wonderful example of a very long-term influence, what I call a migration of a formalism, namely the formalism of a grammar, where you can, for example, see here a small piece of a higher-level programming language. And by higher-level programming language, you mean programming languages that, well, in principle, you don't program in machine code, like zeros or ones, and neither in assembly language, which are also very similar to zeros and ones, but you're programming in higher-level words, like if this is the case, then do that, else do that, etc. So it looks almost slightly a bit like human language. It looks like logic, actually, so to say. Now, interestingly, this is a wonderful example of a very long-term influence. So Panini's grammar, which came from 2,600 years ago, only got applied to another field, in this case computer science, 2,500 years later. Can you imagine? I mean, this is a thrilling example, I think, because sometimes when people ask me what is the usefulness of linguistics or what's the usefulness of humanities in general, then I often say you can never predict beforehand what the usefulness of a beautiful idea like a formal grammar is. And sometimes when I call this example, when I use this example, I say, see, here's an example of an application that only after 2,500 years got applied. So it almost does not make sense to ask when will an idea be applied. I now skip a few centuries. The reason that I'm doing this is that it's not that I don't like the beautiful European Middle Ages or the golden periods of the Arab sciences and humanities, but simply because I think I want to focus on a few fields. So far I focused on linguistics, but I also want to briefly tell you a little bit about the field of philology. Now, the term philology, not to be confused with philosophy, may sound somewhat surprising for you. Who's acquainted actually with the term philology? Who's acquainted with it? Not very much. Yeah, a little bit. So for who was this word, and don't be embarrassed, but for who is this word the first time that you hear about it? For several people, that's interesting. Philology, it also depends on the country where you're coming from, right? Philologie in German is still relatively widely used. If you come from Belgium, for example, indeed, you can still study German, the Germaanse philologie, as they call it. In the Netherlands, the term philology is almost out of date, but once it was one of the most flourishing humanities disciplines. It simply means the study of texts, or the love of the words, actually. That means philologia, yeah. It means loving a word. And it is different from linguistics. You would say, wait a minute, studying text, isn't that the same as studying languages? No. Studying languages is the idea that you want to figure out the underlying grammar or the underlying structure of a language. Whereas studying text can also simply mean that you want to interpret these texts, or you want to, and this is one of the most important things that philology have tried to figure out, you want, on the basis of correspondences and differences in variants of transmitted texts, you want to reconstruct the original text. Now, why was this important? I could briefly go back to the earliest periods. I can briefly say a little bit about the famous Alexandrian school of philology. Maybe you've ever heard about the Museum of Alexandria, a great institute where people from all kinds of disciplines, from, let's say, philosophy, physics, but also history and also philology, work together. And one of their main problems at that time, talking about 300 BC, 300 BCE, one of the main problems at that time was to reconstruct the original text of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And they had really hundreds of different versions. So how could the original text be reconstructed from all these gazillions of different versions? That, for example, sometimes simply happened because a person orally had heard something different from another person, so they made a different word, or even sometimes a different paragraph. But sometimes there were also political reasons. Did you know that? There were political reasons when people added a few words in a text, or even deleted a few words in a text. But interestingly, you can find very precise methods, indeed logically inspired methods, by means of which you can figure out the various correspondences and differences in all the variants of the transmitted texts, and then reconstruct the original text. I'll give you quickly already an example, and then I'll come back to it. You can put all the different texts in a so-called stemma, in a so-called family tree. Okay, but let me first go back to the to this great philologist, Lorenzo Valla. Who has ever heard about Lorenzo Valla? Now that's indeed embarrassing, I would say, because who has ever heard about Galileo Galilei? Basically all of you, perhaps all of you. Some people simply, or perhaps a little bit sleepy, rather to raise their hands. I can't imagine it. I would say Lorenzo Valla is the Galileo of the humanities. But now you see how, yeah really, and I'm not joking here, but now you see how little we know about the history of the humanities actually. Did you realize that? Whereas the history of science is studied very well, and also understandably very well, because it has had immense applications, it is nevertheless embarrassing that the history of humanities is so much understudied. Now why is Lorenzo Valla such an important person? First of all, because he managed to show in the 15th century, 1440 basically, that at that time very important document, also very famous document, the Donatio Constantini, the donation of Constantine, Emperor Constantine, was a forgery. But he did this in a very precise and formal way. It was so precisely done that even the then Pope, Pope Pius II, I think. Yeah, late 15th century, we were already talking about then. He accepted even the result of Valla. And namely, what is this? In other words, what is this document about? This document was about, the Donatio Constantini was about the purported fact, actually the forged fact, that the whole West Roman Empire was given to the Pope by Constantine the Great. Why? Because Constantine the Great, according to this myth, had cured the Pope Sylvester I miraculously from leprosy. And so Constantine, you know, perhaps Emperor Constantine, also the first emperor who, according to the narrative, according to history, was converted to Christianity. Constantine was so grateful that he decided to give this, you see here an image from a Roman church, the emperor giving, kneeling down and giving the Pope the Western Empire. This happened around 312, according to this document. Now, this document basically wrote down exactly why and how the emperor gave this full Western Roman Empire to the Pope. In fact, this was also seen, this document, as a kind of legitimization, as a kind of justification that the Pope had worldly power. Maybe you've ever heard about the Papal State, which existed till the unification of Italy, and you still have a state, it's called Vatican City. So the Pope has actually worldly power. And this was a very important document for the Catholic Church. Now what did actually Valla, here you have an image of him, Valla actually compared various versions of this document, also to the language of the early 4th century. And he discovered, one of the many things he discovered, is that there were words in the particular document that could never have existed in the time of Constantine the Great. Why? Because there were words like, for example, feudus, feudal system. And the feudal system really did not exist in the 4th century. That was a medieval French invention from the 7th century. So with all these particular investigations and discoveries, and especially by putting the various versions of the documents in a kind of stemma, genealogical tree, he actually convincingly demonstrated that the document had to be a forgery from the 7th century. Now, and this methodology first of all, had an immense influence, indeed, in the early 16th century, when Valla's discovery was taken up by the early reformers in Europe, like Martin Luther, but also Melanchthon, the great German philosopher, by taking it up as one of the motives for the Reformation, by saying, hey, look at that, this document is a fake, the donation of Constantine is entirely made up, it is a forgery, and therefore the Pope has no right to have worldly power. But, and I won't go into the historical parts here, the very methodology of Valla was also used later on, much and much later, when it was taken up by the early geneticists. Maybe you've ever heard about Francis and Crick, and also the great, I even forgot her name, you see, Rosalind Franklin. I didn't forget her name. She's often forgotten. Often DNA structures and genetics is referred to by people like Crick and Francis, but Franklin did at least as important work as these two male scientists, so we should never forget her. One important thing here is that this particular method of philological source reconstructions, as I said, you look for transmission errors, was really taken up by the 20th century geneticists. Now here you see again the fascinating, let's say, transfer of knowledge from philology to genetics. And the basic underlying idea is the following, that texts can get corrupted if they are copied, right? If you copy a sentence by hand, if it's just one sentence, you don't that easily make a mistake. But just try to copy a whole text, a whole book, a whole novel. I can guarantee you, you will make several mistakes, right? You will make several small errors, maybe just a letter, as I said, maybe just a comma, but sometimes also a whole paragraph if you don't, if you're not awake enough. And the basic idea is that similarly, also the copying of DNA, so the sequences of nucleotides, can also actually undergo the same kind of errors. And the funny thing is that this was actually very well known by the early geneticists who were trained in grammar schools. And this is a methodology. The underlying idea of this methodology, what we nowadays call stemmatic philology, so the philology of creating trees, stemmas, family trees of texts, is based on the idea that if a certain error, please read with me, if a certain error is created in a transmitted text, for example a missing word, the descendants of that text will likely contain the same common error, because if a later copyist also copies it, he or she will probably not introduce the original word again, simply because the person has no access. I should say only in the case the person has no access to this earlier text, which is actually the typical case. Now, and if more common errors can be determined, we can in principle draw a so-called stemma. Now, it has been widely, this is nothing that I discovered myself, this technique, that it was the very technique to apply it to DNA analysis, was not for the first time studied by myself, but already by Richard Dawkins in his wonderful book in 2008, that he figured out, look at how geneticists were referring initially to philology to figure out how to draw such stemmas. So here is a stemma, this is actually a stemma, a family tree of texts, and there are different variables refer to the different extant texts of a copy of the Argia by Monarchia, by Dante Alighieri. It was actually written in vulgar Latin, but funny enough, if you put all these texts, and this actually means that, for example, these two texts depend on an earlier text that is called beta 1, but it's not a text that we have access to. But by putting all these different texts on the basis of differences and commonalities into a tree, and this is a relatively simple tree, sometimes the trees are much and much bigger, they become as big as, sometimes we have hundreds of different extant texts, then you can actually also try to reconstruct, finally, the archetype of the text. And perhaps, well, the autograph is actually, of course, the written version, but the philologists hope to actually try to figure out the archetype. Oh, by the way, do you see these dotted lines? This means actually that there had been contamination between two copyists. So probably they were sitting next to each other and checking what they were copying. And so we know that these two texts, although they do not depend on the same text, unless we go all the way to this beta, we know that there has been some contamination. And even the very notion of contamination has also an analogy, and even a direct analogy, with contamination of DNA strings. This is all very, very fascinating. So by the way, just to wrap this up, the term philology. Philologists, especially stemmatic philologists, they focus on deletions of words, but also insertions of words, and also, as I say, contaminations. And these are notions that also exist in DNA technology. Very, very fascinating. Beautiful, isn't it, this interaction? And as I said, there has been a migration of these methods from stemmatology, as it's called, stemmatic philology, which once was a flourishing humanities discipline. Nowadays, you can only study it if you go studying classics, let's say Latin and Greek, or theology. In other fields, it's not studied. It's not even taught anymore. Isn't that sad, I would say? But the very formalism method was actually what I call decontextualized by these geneticists and recontextualized, put it into a new context in this new field of genetics. And here's here's a picture of Rosalind Franklin, who died quite early, but she also did the early work with Crick and Watson to work on figuring out the structure of DNA and RNA. Now, philology was at the very time when it was invented as a formal method, it was not only applied, as I say, to biology, because that happened indeed several centuries later. No, it was also applied to the field of history. So now I move from Lorenzo Valla, which I call the Galileo of the humanities, right? I move to Joseph Scaliger. Scaliger is also a fundamental person, and maybe some of you know the name. Ever heard about Scaliger? Not many, you see? It's the same problem. Yeah, some. Yeah, I see you there. Or maybe it was a... Yeah? What do you know about him?
I don't know anything, but I recognize his name.
You know his name. Well, Scaliger is an interesting person. His father was Italian. He came from Verona, actually, the Scaligeri family. But his father, Julius Caesar Scaliger, moved to France, where his youngest son, he had 9 sons, amazing, his youngest son, Joseph Justus Scaliger, became a devout Calvinist, which in France at that time was quite dangerous. So he was a Huguenot, as we call them in the Netherlands, Huguenot, who fled basically to the Netherlands, and he became the first university professor in Leiden in 1591, I think, if I'm right. Yeah. And as a university professor, you didn't have to teach anything. You just had to keep your PhD students. And one of his most famous PhD students was Grotius, Hugo de Groot, a legal scholar from the Netherlands. But what made Scaliger so important was the fact that he used philological methods to figure out the chronology of the world. That was his idea. He wanted to figure out all these different histories, the history of Babylonia, the history of Ethiopia, the history of Egypt, but also the history of Greece, the history of the Roman Empire. They were based all on different calendars, and he wanted to figure out one big chronology so as to, reconstruct history. And he also had a devout Calvinist idea, because he wanted to figure out when was exactly the earth being created. So we want to figure out what was the exact date of the creation. That was an old idea where many people thought we can derive that idea, the creation of the date of the creation of the earth. We can derive that perhaps from the Hebrew Bible. But Scaliger said we have to look at all kinds of sources. And we have to go back to the oldest source. So we should not rely on authority, like the church fathers, like Augustine or others. No, we really should always go back to the oldest source. I call it the principle of oldest source that he put forward. Now you might say this is trivial. Of course you should go back to the oldest source, but at his time this was not trivial. It was actually quite heterodox, so to say. What did he discover? Scaliger discovered when he finally managed, after an enormous amount of work, and he really knew 30 or 31 languages. He knew Ethiopian. He was not able actually to decipher the hieroglyphs, but he had access to a number of Hellenistic Egyptian scholars, and these Egyptian scholars wrote in Greek. So, and one of the important scholars that he figured out, Manetho, he reconstructed that text, and he reconstructed also, so he used philology, basically, and he also reconstructed other versions of Manetho's list of kings, or list of pharaohs, and he made a surprising discovery that he could not even accept himself, namely that there had actually been pharaohs living before the then widely accepted date of the creation of the world. And that date was more or less considered to be 4000 BC, before Christ. Why? Because you could figure out from the Old Testament if you go back with all this lineage, with all these family names, then more or less you came, you arrived at the date of 4000 BCE, even though there were some famous chronologists, as they were called, so historians, chronologists, like the Bishop Usher from Ireland. He said, no, the date of the creation of the earth was actually happened on the 20th of October 4799 at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. He really made a very precise estimate. But according to Scaliger, this was all wrong. There had been people living before the creation of the earth. How was that possible? Now you can imagine that this for a devout, for a very pious Calvinist was impossible to accept. So Scaliger did a surprising move. He made a surprising move. He just invented a notion what he called proleptic time. Proleptic. Tempo prolepticon, which means time before time. That's funny, isn't it? So he just put all these, let's say, Egyptian kings, but also Chinese emperors, just in the time before time. Because there had also been Chinese emperors that had lived before the creation of the earth. Now, interestingly, for Scaliger, this was just a result that had to be postponed to be resolved later. But for his followers, like Isaac Vossius, but also the great Spinoza, born in Amsterdam, philosopher, they just said, no, the Bible cannot be trusted as a historical source. You should just get rid of the Bible as a historical source and take other sources more reliable. So it actually led to the Enlightenment, what we nowadays call it. Fascinating, isn't it? This had actually a major impact on the Western worldview, as you can say. I can go on forever. I can talk about, but given the time, I won't do that. I can talk about the various interactions between humanists, humanities scholars, and natural scientists. And one of the most beautiful interactions is actually the father of Galileo Galilei, whose name was Vincenzo Galilei. Vincenzo was actually here you have the son. Vincenzo was actually a musicologist. He studied the history of Greek music, or whatever was transmitted thereof, and he created what we nowadays call the empirical cycle. And he gave that empirical cycle of testing and studying, and then changing a little bit the theory and figuring out whether your theory can even better predict what he called the dissonances and consonances of music. He transmitted that to his own son, who applied that empirical cycle to the study of moving balls and moving movement in general. But also I could talk about the 19th century linguistics. So going back to a field that at that time was called comparative philology, where you discover that there is a relation between all these different languages. I could talk about the study of music. I could talk about the study of art, for example, the study of linear perspective, which was carried out initially by Italian humanists, but which was taken over by German humanities scholars. But one of the interesting things here about the discovery of the Indo-European language tree is that it directly had an influence on the work of Charles Darwin. So the notion of an evolutionary tree, where you see that the original language, the idea of an original language, we have older languages by now, but that there is a kind of proto-Indo-European language, which came from the work by August Scaliger, who came first up with an evolutionary language tree, was literally taken up by Darwin in 1859 in his famous book, The Origin of Species. And interestingly, one of the most beautiful interactions that I find here is that more than a century later, the Italo-American geneticist Luigi Cavalli Sforza, he figured out that these wonderful distinctions between languages also correspond to a very high extent, more than 97% in the case of the cases, to genetic differences between people. So here you have a kind of linguistic result which is then confirmed by more general, let's say, genetic results. Now, on the other hand, I should also admit that this wonderful idea of having an original language, which was, according to the linguists, the purest language ever, which even started before Sanskrit. Sanskrit is found here, but you have several versions that came out from this Proto-Indo-European language. Their idea, and I'm talking about linguists and religion scholars like Max Müller, Christian Lassen, and others, they believed that there was also a corresponding people that was equally pure, which was called the Aryan people, according to them. Here we have the Aryan idea. So it also led to the idea of an Aryan race, and we know what kind of terrible consequences that had. It led in the end to the idea of scientific racism, that there was a pure people and impure people, etc. So it's not the case that all humanities ideas are always having nice and interesting consequences. I don't know if you've ever heard about the book Not for Profit, why Humanities Are Important for Democracy by Martha Nussbaum. Anybody heard about that book, Not for Profit? Yeah, some cool. So she claims that humanities is always interesting and important for democracy, but certainly not all ideas. This idea of finding an original language that had to coincide with original pure people does not really has not had really positive consequences. It had actually quite negative consequences. Okay. I can't skip my own field, the field of digital humanities, where you apply, or where we apply actually methodologies and also techniques from computer science to humanities disciplines. One of the earliest approaches in the field of digital humanities was the idea of Roberto Busa, an Italian Jesuit, whom I've met several times, but who died already 8 years ago by now. He had as an original idea to apply computers also to texts. He wanted to create a kind of lemmatization, an automatic lemmatization of all texts of Dr. Aquinas, Thomas of Aquinas. And this text contains something like 11 million words, and rather by doing it by hand, he wanted to create automatically an index. And when he was talking with the then director of IBM, Watson said, it can't be done. Computers can work with numbers, but they cannot work with texts. That's funny, right? Because we now know that computers also work with text. But at that time, I think Watson was also right, Thomas Watson, because the memory was so limited, you basically had to change switches of your computer if you wanted to store some memory. Memory was so expensive and so limited at that time, in 46, that you could simply not store more than, let's say, a few sentences of text. So this had to be stored on punch cards and in different ways. And importantly enough is that this guy, Roberto Busa, was stubborn enough to convince, in the end, IBM by actually trying to apply computers to texts and to work with text, which had an enormous impact, as we nowadays know. So again, we see here a beautiful interaction. Now, I could go on forever. I could also move more to the modern humanities. So here I say I focus just on a few other discoveries in the more recent humanities that have so-called changed the world. The very idea by Gérard Genette that no text can be neutral. This is a long-standing idea coming already from the 1960s perhaps, but Genette made it very, very popular, and this is even taken over by UNESCO nowadays, that every text has always the world view of the writer, right? Here are some other examples of let's say, of important insights of the humanities. I won't go into them, but I'll give the slides to Dora if you want to read more about it. And of course, also nowadays, still humanities scholars are, given some commissions, they are asked to figure out some important problems. For example, here you have the impact of historical interpretations in the Netherlands, where well, this is not that recent, it's already 15 years ago perhaps, but Michel Bout, who is a colleague of mine here at the University of Amsterdam, was given the task by the Dutch government to figure out whether the current Queen Maxima of the Netherlands, whether her father actually was wrong, had been wrong during the Argentinian dictatorship under Fidela, or whether he was right, so to say. And okay, Michel Bout, he said, this guy was actually wrong, so he should not be invited for Maxima's marriage with the current King William Alexander. But you can see how important sometimes historical research can be. Here's another example, I won't go into that. I come to an end now, so you've been very patient and you're very friendly with me. You've not been complaining too much, although at a certain moment I saw you were losing a little bit, perhaps, attention, very understandably. I'm talking, I'm giving you so much information. So, but here's an overview, a quick overview, and I did not talk about all of these things. I skipped art theory, I skipped perhaps some other fields. No, I only skipped art theories today. But the overview of the impact of the humanities is enormous, and from this list you can also nicely see what the interactions between humanities and science actually is. So if you're ever asked at, let's say, parties, but what is the usefulness of humanities? You can also now have actually a kind of ammunition. You can say, wait a minute, the humanities have led, for example, to the Reformation. Think about Lorenzo Valla. They have led to the Enlightenment. Think about Scaliger. They have led to the scientific revolution. If you think about Vincenzo Galilei influencing his son. They have led indirectly to genetics, to the digital revolution in ICT. So what would you like to know more? The main question is then, why are these great humanistic feats not known? Now, I won't go into that. Actually, main reason and the main answer to it is that it is again due to a couple of philosophers, well, not only this couple, but also a large number of not only philosophers, also humanities scholars in the field of all fields, including my own field, linguistics, including literary studies, including history, that actually continue to claim, basically, that humanities should mainly focus on interpretation. And whenever they do actually make great discoveries, these are not that important. So usually humanities scholars, just think about it, try to undermine their own great discoveries. It's really true. Whereas scientists usually try to, correctly I think also, to show off with their great discoveries. And I think this could be better balanced perhaps, so that actually we can see, and I hope also that my talk has made clear, that both fields have had actually simply equally impact. Both fields, both domains, of course, are part of our general tree of knowledge. So I won't go into all the slides, but I just simply want to jump to the conclusions in order to leave some time for questions. Namely that I have hoped to show to you that the very idea of reasoning patterns, be it in formal grammar or in stemmas, in trees for philology, are found both in the humanities and of course as well as in the sciences. But it's true that in the humanities, patterns are always followed by interpretations. It's never enough to figure out a pattern, you also have to interpret it. How is it possible that certain, let's say, Egyptian kings were living before the creation of the earth? It really needs an interpretation. And there are also, as I hope to have shown to you today, some typical humanistic methods that really came out from the humanities scholarship and that were later on transferred to the sciences and technology. And some of the approaches that I've briefly mentioned today was the grammatical approach, the genealogical approach, by creating these beautiful history trees, and also the, which I barely scratched the surface of, the hermeneutic approach. Okay, thank you very much.